Welcome to Thinking Deeply about Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time poor but enthusiasm rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Stuart Welsh. Hi, Stuart. How are you?
Hi there, Kieran. I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. Not too bad at all. We're going to focus our attention on the design of professional development. I don't know if sessions is the right word, opportunities, but however we deliver our professional development, there's some level of thought needs to go into the individual modules or nodes. And so I thought, when beginning to design a professional development session, what do you think about first?
That's a great question, to be honest. And just maybe before we dig into that, you said there professional development session or opportunity, and so often professional development, it needs to be sustained over time. So there is something in mind when you're planning a session. Does this fit as a piece in a bigger sort of trajectory or a bigger PD sort of journey? But if we're thinking about just a sort of standalone session, then I think the first thing is, am I clear on the problem here that we're trying to solve? And what is it that has drawn these teachers or has sort of necessitated this PD session with this particular topic? So I need to think about what is this problem, and it has to be kind of grounded in the teachers. I try and focus all my PD on the teachers that are in the classroom that are dealing with all the tricky factors and variables that are going on in the classroom all the time. So I'm thinking about what is the current problem we're trying to solve, and that could be things like lack of participation from students, maybe, or students not remembering things, poor retention, that sort of thing. And I think we want to then consider, what's the teacher's current state now. This is going to be different for everybody, but in some ways this is like problem solving at maths. What's the current state, what's the goal state, and then we start thinking about how are we going to sort of help those teachers structure their practice towards solving the problem. And so the tools and the stepping stones, I'm then starting thinking, what strategies have I used, what techniques have I discovered, and particularly what research exists that we can then start to sort of weave in to that PD. So I suppose it's sort of define the problem, think about the end state, and then start thinking about the steps to get us there using sort of research-based principles, but also keeping it grounded in practical sort of classroom relevant sort of solutions. So I suppose that's my kind of starting point. But what would you say to that?
I think it sort of matches up with my current thinking quite a bit too. I mean, obviously, I think the assumption, particularly for those people who've listened to that for a while, will know that we're operating under the idea that effective PD is a long, carefully structured process. So when we talk about the individual modules, I think I'm 100% with you, and I know listeners will be too, in terms of, we're always thinking about where we want to be at the end of the year, where we want to be at the end of 3 years, 5 years, even when people are thinking really carefully about things. I like how you frame it in a problem, even if there isn't necessarily what we would typically describe as a problem. I think framing it in such a way helps with the storytelling aspect, because we know that we remember stories. And so I like to try and frame things in terms of, this is the issue, this is the problem that we as the main characters here need to solve, and what follows will then almost potentially follow that story arc. Maybe not exactly right. I mean, if anyone listened to Chris Yule's episode, we talked about Dan Harmon's story circle. And I sort of like to use that as a general structure in terms of, well, how am I going to tell this story? How am I going to get my points across? And in a way that is familiar to the teachers. So I like that. And then also, like, for the last week or so, we've been bagging on about goal state, current state with a lot of people. So it's really good to see that coming through in this chat, because that big journey will be, where do we want to be? Where are we now? Where do we want to be? What are those parts? So you mentioned thinking about the strategies. I think to an extent you will already have decided, having mapped out, okay, I think, high leverage thing to get in place is retrieval practice, because we know the gains that has on learning. And then we'll have mapped out those things further into the future. For me, quite often it's the things that take the most time, almost you see them a couple of times. So a really long way of saying I'm on board with your thinking. I mean, the storytelling aspect ever cross your mind, or is that not something you've thought about?
So I was wondering how long it would take you to sort of mention storytelling in this context, and I think that it does make perfect sense because, as you say, people relate to stories, people understand stories, and it kind of is a story arc as we're going through our professional development, and so that makes perfect sense to me. That we sort of we're trying to align the PD, which is bringing new experiences, new knowledge, and new learning, with sort of trying to ground it in the experience of the attendees and keep the relevance there and sort of take them with us on the journey. And I'm sure we'll say this over and over in this conversation in many different ways, but to some extent, planning and delivering PD mirrors a lot of what effective teaching practice looks like, whether it's getting a sense of kind of prior knowledge to try and best understand your starting points and get your pitch level, or whether it's giving the group opportunities to actually sort of rehearse and to try things out. So I think that there are a lot of similarities because, as we've said a few times, we're all very, very similar in the way we learn, whether we are in school learning traditional sort of school-based subjects or whether we're teachers at whatever stage in our profession trying to push our expertise on and on. So, there's a lot of principles from the science of learning that we can build into the PD design.
I mean, it's really interesting you mentioned that because I think one of the things you do with your class is you try and assess prior knowledge before you enter the classroom for that lesson, because if you're doing it on the hoof, it's more difficult. I'm not saying you can't, because I know that both of us will, in CPD sessions when we're not based in the school, we'll both sort of be making these sort of quick judgments. Which bits do I spend more time on? Which bits do I spend less time on? But I have almost like the audience of people who they're working with their colleagues. They're building up this understanding of where they are. But right at the start, or when something new has been introduced, what sort of things can people do in school to get that pitch right and almost like to realize, okay, this is what I need to spend time on? But thinking that people don't have time for surveys and they're probably not, the people who need it aren't going to fill them in. So what sort of things can we do? Is that something that ever crossed your mind?
So yeah, I think you're trying here to get at strategies or techniques to basically make the PD design and the delivery that little bit easier by coming equipped with some knowledge of the group that you're working with. And very often when we work with schools or groups of schools, we are talking to senior leaders well in advance of a PD session, and we're using sort of tapping into their own understanding of the staff and getting a sense of what's currently going on in the classrooms and where the teachers might be finding some challenges or what the areas of focus have been and how successful they've been. So there's always ways of gauging where the group are at. I think pre-PD surveys probably is a bit much, a bit sort of laborious. You're right. I think some people will not fill them in, and it might well be the people you really want to hear from who don't fill them in. And so that does leave us in that kind of delicate position of doing some of this on the fly. And I was delivering some PD today actually, and I was talking about teachers who are sort of skilled enough to be able to diagnose current level of understanding in the moment and respond and adapt their teaching. But that does take real expertise, and I think that takes expertise in PD delivery as well. So, you're going to have to try and do something at the start of these sessions that gives you a quick sort of sense of who you're working with. And it's probably worth remembering that just like any class has a range of sort of prior knowledge and sort of prior attainment, any group of teachers that you're working with will also have a range of sort of knowledge, and there'll be misconceptions in there. And you might find that there are people who know a lot about what you're talking about. And whereas in a class, sometimes those students might just be quite happy to say, this is an easy lesson, I'm just going to sit back because I can do most of this. Sometimes in PD sessions, you'll find that actually you end up with a lot of dialogue with people who are quite knowledgeable, and you have to be prepared for that to make sure that you've got evidence and justification. So I would always start a session with some sort of think, pair, share type activity, or some, what does this term mean to you? Let's define this term, or tell me what, you know, questioning looks like in your classroom or something, discussing groups, and then I'll get round the groups and I'll try and listen and speak. And immediately from the beginning of the session, I'm sort of getting a good idea of how I'm going to pitch the rest of this session.
Nice. I like the way you sort of built in the time there for you to get a grip. And then because you'll have a grasp of the content yourself, because I mean, we're probably coming to this from a position where you're not introducing something you just read about. You know, if we go back to the first episodes of Tadapa, we also talk about being a year ahead of ourselves. And so I like that because then you can make your expert decision in the moment. One thing Chris Such always says is that because quite often he's delivering the key messages from his first book, or certainly he has been for a while. And there will be people who have read the book and will understand it. And he sort of qualifies and says, some of you will understand this, but then you need to think about it as well, how can I help others understand this? And you come at it from a different sort of point of ingress, or maybe just with a different lens. And I think that can really help, because even if you are hearing the message for the third, fourth time, you've got that space to think about the bits you haven't thought about in the past. I'm thinking about all the research ed sessions about retrieval practice. Even fourth, fifth, sixth one, I was still going, oh yeah, and that's how that could work in this situation. And that's why it's a desirable difficulty or whatever. So yeah, so I like that. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Do you have a model that you use to scaffold your session design?
I definitely do. And again, we're sort of looking back to best part of 20 years in the classroom and lots of badly planned, poorly planned, or not at all planned lessons. And then you do find a bit of a structure that fits for you. And I'm not saying this is one size fits all at all, but I think over the years of delivering PD to different groups, I've kind of at the moment settled on something that feels like it works quite well. So if I'm going to be designing a session, then I need to build in something at the beginning that's going to help me get the sense of where the teachers are and their level of understanding. So just as we talked about there, some sort of define a term or explain what this looks like in your classroom, because I want to just get their, activate some prior knowledge, essentially, give them a chance to just sort of frame this session in their own context, which is so important. And then I think, you've got to kind of really outline that problem. So having listened to what they've said, then sort of take charge, give a summary, outline that problem, talk about the pain points, basically, paint the sort of reality of it and get everybody thinking, this sounds like, things I've struggled with. This is a challenge. It's good to know everybody's, struggling with these challenges. And then that's where we open the door and say, well, these are the things that are going to help us move towards solving this problem. So I would, I would always try, certainly now, to break the session into maybe 3 or 4 kind of key principles, like key kind of generic, not strategies, but ideas, because I want it to be at a high level so that teachers of geography and history and science and all of the other subjects, and whether you're kindergarten or if you're top of secondary school, whatever that is, I want these principles to be broad enough that people can relate to them and can start thinking about how they can apply it in their context. So the principles have to be grounded in research. And then I'll go into the specifics of, well, this principle, let's just say it's the testing effect. Then here are some strategies that we can then put in the classroom that will help us capitalize on this principle or take advantage of this principle. And so there'll be a sort of back and forth between here's a principle, here's a strategy, another principle, another strategy. So we'll do a bit of that. But what I quite like to do as I'm designing this is think, well, where are there opportunities in this sort of cycle to build in some reflection or some discussion, or even, again, I think I mentioned I did a PD today, build in an opportunity for the teachers to act as students and let them actually take part in one of the sort of strategies. And so, we were doing a bit on retrieval practice, and we did a kind of free recall type task, which was based on the first 6 slides of the PD, which I thought was really kind of interesting to do. especially when I went round. And obviously, you have to go around and see what is stuck and are there any misconceptions. And really interesting to see some of the things that have stood out for people. I'm very guilty of going off on a tangent and telling an anecdote, and then suddenly these are the things that people remember, and that's a reminder for me to try and keep the focus, on the topic. But building in some chances for them to actually experience the tasks, I think, is really powerful. And then really, when we come to the end, it's good to have, planned in some opportunity for overall reflection, and just even asking them what one thing has resonated the most with you, or that's kind of classic. What one thing you want to explore a bit further, and what one thing might you change in your classroom as a result of this session, and then just spend a bit of time gathering that feedback. But when you and I talked about this quite recently, actually, our good friend Johnny Hall is very, very good at this. I said I would start the session with a think, pair, share activity, and you said that gives you the time to listen to people and start to understand how to pitch the session. I think ending the session with some sort of activity as well is quite good, because timing always matters. And if you've got a kind of elastic session at the activity at the end that could be 3 minutes, could be 5, could be 7, depending on pacing, then that just gives you that buffer zone to be professional as you come to the end. And you can either say, okay, this is a task you can take away and think about, or we've got 3 minutes, have this task, 6 minutes, let's do this task, whatever. And it just puts a nice kind of end cap on the session, I think.
With maths in particular, whenever you get into a really meaty problem, like say you're exploring something like challenge and depth, and you really go into the mathematics, like low threshold, high ceiling, whatever. Sometimes you could have like 40 minutes just doing that one task. And so having that almost like a gap task where actually we can come back and we can reflect on this the next time we sort of revisit this idea, I think it'd be really, really powerful. But also it allows for some forgetting, and for some of the session to sort of erode from your memory, and then actually engaging with this idea is going to be beneficial in the long run, I think. Nobody's perfect. Some of us are close, but not many of us. What mistakes have you made when designing professional development?
Yes, some of us are close, but not quite perfect yet. I mean, I think I'm probably still making mistakes, and in fact, I know I'm still making mistakes, and I'm happy enough to admit that, because I want to continue to improve the quality of the PD that I deliver. Certainly, early on, like many people, I think, when you first stand up in front of a group of teachers, your peers, to talk about something that you've been doing, you're wanting to try and share everything that you've done, and I've certainly been guilty on many occasions of over preparing. I think 180 slides I got through in a 60-minute session once. Nobody had a clue what was going on, I don't think, at that one, but I think definitely too much content in there. There've been times when I love the research and I'm fascinated with the studies, and when I find one study, I think, well, what about older children, or what about different subjects? And I look at another study, and suddenly my enthusiasm for research papers is kind of creeping in, and you can see people glazing over, because not everybody wants a full blow-by-blow account of how this study was conducted. So mistakes have been trying to cram in too much, going too deep into the research, and then also just sort of forgetting that teachers have often had a long day. PD's quite often after school. Maybe there was a parents' night the night before. Maybe there's reports are due. There's marking piling up, and so they need to think. They need to think deeply. They need to engage, but also you want to give them a few things that are almost packaged up and ready for them to just kind of roll with. And so I think I have. It's not so much a mistake, but I've certainly made much more of an effort to add in more practical, almost ready to use, or at least ready to adapt and try in your context type activities. I've probably also been guilty of just being the one that does all the talking, and probably thousands of students, if you add them up, that I've taught would all agree with that as well. But so I've not been building in enough time for discussion, or maybe even going in kind of deep into some elements, and I really now enjoy that because just I've sort of said this a few times about the teachers with classes. I think when the teachers are talking all the time, then it might look like there's a lot of control, but actually, I think that's where the teachers are forcing the structure. Where teachers have real control is when they can open up the conversation and hear different viewpoints and kind of roll with it and modify the kind of course. You're still going the same way, but there's a looseness that comes when you invite others to share their thinking, and that's really, really enjoyable. When you're delivering the PD, and I think it's important for teachers to feel that they are being, given the opportunity to talk about their experiences, and also that they're being listened to. That's certainly feedback that I get. Sometimes it's just thanks for listening to all of that. So mistakes have probably been packing in too much, talking too much, not letting people have the rich discussions that are there. So I suppose the main lesson from all of that is that it probably is better to go deeper on a few things and give teachers a couple of things to act upon rather than bombard them with a dozen ideas, because there's a real danger that there's overload there and that nothing actually sticks.
Part of me is thinking that actually recording yourself might be helpful with those, because A, you'll get a sense of time, and B, I think if you watch yourself back, you soon realize when you're going, when the breaks are or the beats are between you and sort of the people you're working with in the session. And so, yeah, because like for me, the issue is always the first time I do something, I'll quite often try and design tasks that I haven't really used before in the past. Like if something's something I've been testing out for a long time, you usually get a sense on how it goes. But when something's new or really bespoke, I think I would benefit from testing it out with peers to see what their responses are. I know that's not always possible, but like when I was in school, I had like a maths working party kind of thing across our federated sister school, which is a special school in our school. And thinking back, I probably would have benefited from testing out some of the tasks and thinking about, well, how do we react to this? Because I have had times where they haven't landed properly, or I mean, this happens most times when the first time around, something's shorter than I think, or something's much longer and developed or needs explained better than I think. And so it's almost thinking about what can we do to give ourselves oversight of where we're likely to go wrong. But I mean, the thing is, second, third time, you get a handle on it, don't you? So maybe it's not something to worry about.
Well, you touch on a really important point there, because like any sort of band touring with their greatest hits, it does become so much easier to deliver a similar session second, third, fourth, fifth time, and that's kind of a different sort of conversation to some extent, because if we're just talking about planning from scratch and delivering for first time, yeah, there's so many factors to consider, but it is also important to remember that we should reflect on the PD session and think, well, how did that land? And where could I have maybe cut some content to allow me to go deeper into this other part? And that's a critical part of doing this. So I would always try and review the sessions. In fact, if you can do a feedback form, if it's a Google form or something like that, very short at the end of the form, just at the end of the session, just to get some of the thoughts from the attendees, then that can be really useful in terms of planning. So any other mistakes that you've made over the years, Kieran, delivering PD?
I mean, at the very start, probably your typical ones, like evoking the redundancy effect by reading exactly what was on the slides, having terrible images and collages, so to speak. It was a good day when that stuff stopped. And then almost overestimating the teachers listening, like thinking nobody really wants to hear what I've got to say, and then like almost like your delivery is impoverished because you don't think your colleagues want to hear from you, or need to hear from you. And I think that's quite an obstacle to get over. But once you realize that, I think most people are on your side in your staff meetings, in your training sessions, and certainly when you work in the school. And I think that becomes a bit easier, and you almost grow in confidence once you see the reaction of people. But yeah, but it would have been the typical sort of presentation of information would have been poor, and not believing that what I had to say was of value. Because then, if you don't believe, how can you expect other people to believe in what you're saying. So I think it's really, really important, but I know it's not easy. It wasn't easy for me. And I know lots of people listening to me thinking, well, I am probably in the same boat. But actually, it just takes practice to get over that, I think. Yeah, what you say about reflection is really, really important because even though you're now thinking about the next 4, 5, 6, whatever number of years in your own school, at some point you're going to be starting the journey potentially anew. And so there's no reason why your session on retrieval practice from 10 years ago, that might not be the structure that you use in 5 years' time when you're sort of implementing school or the coaching model, whatever it might be. So I think even though we're very much focused on in the now in our current school, having that eye on, okay, I may need to start this journey over again. I don't know. It's very rarely people are in their forever school. It feels like, certainly in England, 4 or 5 year cadence, and then you're moving to the next sort of challenge. So having that bank of here are the PD sessions that work really well, then you're making small tweaks as you go forward. So if we had to sum up everything into almost like, I don't know if guiding principles, but certainly the sort of the key features, what do you think the keys to effective professional development design might be?
It's a bit like a curriculum, actually, isn't it? You want to make sure that you're clear, that you've got a clear aim, probably there's not too much in there, so you're not trying to achieve too much, and that there's a structure. So the structure can be transferable, regardless of the kind of theme of the PD. So get that aim kind of locked in, have that structure, however you want it to be. Like I've suggested, maybe pepper it with opportunities for discussion or activities, and get the balance right between research and practical. But definitely, bring in that research and give the links or give the study title, the titles of the papers and the researchers to the group. And if people want to read more, they can read more. But I think that this is important, is that we're not trying to encourage teachers to use strategies and techniques and approaches that we haven't actually tried ourselves. This is something that's so important to me, is that, going back to your point that you made there about maybe mistakes and things that you might have done differently in the past, I feel very, very confident when I'm discussing PD and approaches, strategies and techniques, because I've done them and I've seen them work. And if I haven't actually done it myself, I've seen it working in a different context with other teachers. So that, for me, gives a huge amount of confidence, and I hope that projects, in terms of I appear kind of credible when I'm talking from my own experience. As I said, best part of 20 years teaching, and spent a lot of time in other lessons as well. So the keys are to definitely have the research, classroom tested ideas. I think we need tasks and activities, and then think about the follow-up, because although we might enjoy a 45, a 60, a 90-minute PD, what is going to happen as a result? And so the challenge is always to talk to the teachers and say, now, what are you going to commit to? And maybe if you can talk to senior leadership and say, just, one thing, what are you going to look out for? What are you going to recap on at the staff meeting? So structure, research, plenty of tasks grounded in experience, and then think about how it can become sustained.
Yeah, and that almost takes us full circle and almost off into a conversation about effective implementation more broadly. We talked about that part of the big journey, that follow up. That's the most important part. You do your 60 minutes, maybe 45 minutes, depending on where you are, and then what do you do next? That's the key. So I think you've done really well to really reduce it down to its most component parts. I would tend to agree. It's funny you mention your credibility, because that's actually on my list of things to discuss during your annual review. So be prepared to discuss that at a very serious and future meeting. But I think, this is a time of year where people are starting to think about next year. So they may be thinking about, different roles, increased responsibility, the chance to contribute more broadly to school life. And so I think, considering, especially if it's your first time, don't stress about making mistakes. Everybody makes them constantly. But now's the time to think about, well, how can I put the systems in place, the pieces in place, so that actually it goes better than I could have hoped. So I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom and experience, Stuart. All that's left to do is say thank you very much for joining me.
Well, it's been a pleasure, Kieran, as always. Thank you for having me.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.